Hey guys, Angie from Block 81 here. Today, I'm going to show you how to get that Polaroid photo frame effect in Photoshop. Let's get started. Alright, so first things first, you're going to need the actual Polaroid PSD, which you can buy from me at creativemarket.com. Link is in the description below. When you've made your purchase, you'll be able to download straight from Creative Market and you'll get a zip file. Double click the zip file to open it up and get the actual PSD. Double click on that PSD file to open it up in Photoshop. When you open it up, you'll see that you've got a few layers. You've got the actual Polaroid frame, the area where your photo goes, and the background. Now, the background actually doesn't matter because what we're going to do is we're going to take the Polaroid itself after we've dropped the image that you need on it, and we're going to put it into a different Photoshop file so that the background is actually whatever you need it to be. The background is there just to give you something other than white. Alright, so now what we need to do is find a photo that we want to drop into this Polaroid. So here's a little tip. I like to use unsplash.com. It's a website that allows you to download really good quality stock photos for absolutely free. You can use them anywhere you want for anything you want pretty much. I'm going to head over to the nature category because that feels about right, and I'm going to choose this photo right here. So now back in Photoshop, I'm going to click on the layer called Your Photo here. That layer is a smart object. There's a link below in the description on smart objects if you're not super familiar with them, but they're really handy. So be sure to read that and get brushed up on your smart objects. So when I double click that smart object, it opens it up into its own document, its own file inside Photoshop. It's basically a file within a file in your PSD. One of the easiest ways to drop your photo into the smart object is to grab the photo from the desktop and just drag it onto Photoshop like so. The other way to do this is to head up to File and click on Place Embedded. You may note that under the File menu, there's also a Place Linked option. I'm not going to get into the differences in there. There are plenty of articles and tutorials online. You can read up on how those two things are different. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and place embedded. So once I've clicked place embedded, it's going to ask me to find the photo. I'm going to find it on my computer and then hit the place button. That places the photo inside this smart object. Now obviously we'll want to make sure that the photo fills up the entire area in the smart object. So we're going to go ahead and resize it. So a couple of quick little tips here when you're resizing. First of all, you're going to hit Command-T on your keyboard if you're on a Mac. I believe it's Control-T on a PC. Command-T will give you that transform to allow you to resize it. Now, if you hold down the Option key on your keyboard as you're resizing, what that does is it resizes the image from the center. It's really handy when you're trying to just fill up an area like we are here. The other thing you'll want to do is hold down Shift on your keyboard. It keeps the proportions on your image the same so that you're not getting any weird stretchiness or anything like that. Now if you hold down both the Option and the Shift key at the same time as you're resizing, it's going to do both of those things at the same time. Again, it's super handy. I use it all the time. Okay, so now that I've got it the size that I want, I'm going to reposition it. That looks about right. So now the photo area layer below here, we don't need that anymore. You can keep it if you want, but since we don't need it, I'm just going to go ahead and delete it just by hitting delete on my keyboard. Alright, so now that we're all set, you can see that there's a little asterisk up in the file name at the top, and that means that the document hasn't been saved yet. So we need to go ahead and save it. So you can either go File Save, or what I like to do, which is use the keyboard, just hit Command-S and that saves it. Then you can close that document. And as soon as you close that document, there's the photo. Okay, so this looks pretty good. You could add some filters or change the lighting, what have you, any of that good stuff to kind of make it look more retro and vintage, but I'm not going to do that just for the sake of time. However, there is one piece that's missing here, and that's the writing that goes underneath. If you're familiar with Polaroids at all, which were super popular decades ago, one of the things that people really like to do is write down something about that photo right on the bottom of that Polaroid. It was either the location or just some way to remember that particular shot. So the key to do it digitally is to use a font that makes sense. Pick one that really makes sense, that looks like it was written with a pen or a marker or something to that extent. So I'm going to go ahead and type in some text here. And you can see that it actually isn't showing up. Alright, so I've typed that in. Even though we can't see it, I'm going to hit escape on my keyboard to commit that text. And we can see in the layers panel that the layer is sitting below the Polaroid frame. And that is why we can't see it. So we're just going to drag that to be the topmost layer so that we can see it. But we're going to keep that layer within the Polaroid folder so that we can drag the entire thing into our new document later. Okay, so right now the text isn't the color that we need it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that that layer is selected and click on this color swatch here up at the top. And I'm going to choose kind of a not quite fully black, kind of grayish, dark gray color. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and commit that change. Now, this is a little bit boring, so I'm going to add a couple of exclamation points here. And now if you take a look, the font isn't right at all. It looks very digital. It doesn't look like anybody wrote it. So let's go ahead and choose another font. So the font I'm going to use is called Flood, and there's a link to how you can get that font below in the description. Okay, so this looks really good. I really like this font. I think it looks decent. However, it's far too small. So we're going to resize it, and there are actually a couple of ways to do that. So one of the obvious ways is to head up here and simply choose a different size. So for instance, maybe I want to choose 72, and that actually doesn't look too bad. But the other way to do it, which I find is often a little bit easier if you're not too particular about the point sizes in Photoshop, is to simply do a Command T to get that transform again like we did earlier and just resize the text that way. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit return on my keyboard to commit that. I'm going to hit V on my keyboard now so that I can get the select tool and kind of line this up the way that I think is going to work well. Now, right now it's very digital still, even though the font looks like kind of a marker. The problem, however, is that when you actually write on a surface with a marker, you can see the surface kind of show through, especially if it's not a brand new marker, and you can see the surface of whatever it is you're writing on. And that is very true for Polaroids. So there are things that you can do, which I'm not going to do right now because it would just take far too long, but there are things you can do to make it look more realistic. One of those things is just to lower the opacity a little bit, but that still doesn't look that great. It requires a little bit more intricacy to get the feel realistic. But like I said, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of that. If this were an actual design project that I was doing for a client, then I would take a lot more time and I would go through all of those steps to make it look a lot more realistic. Okay, so we could call this done, but what I want to do is put this Polaroid on a different background and really make it pop a little bit. So let's say we're going to put this on Instagram. In order to do that, we want to create a new file. So in Photoshop, I'm going to hit Command N on my keyboard to get a new file, and I'm going to make it 1600 by 1600. Then I hit create and it gives me a new document. So for my background, I'm going to head back over to unsplash.com and I'm going to find a kind of related picture, but nothing too detailed, because what I'm going to do is just turn it into more of a background that isn't super obvious. Okay, so now that I've downloaded this file, I'm going to head back into Photoshop. I'm going to click on File, then Place Embedded to grab that and resize it accordingly. Alright, now I've got the background image set up. I'm going to head back over to the Polaroid file. I'm going to collapse the Polaroid folder. So then I'm going to hit V on my keyboard to make sure I've got the Move tool selected. And that allows me to move the entire group since I have the folder selected. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag so that I have that entire group, that folder, moving around. And I'm going to drag it up to the tab of the other document. And then I'm going to, once that document kind of shows up, then I'm going to drop it. I'm going to hold Shift down, however, because what that does is it drops it straight in the middle of the file, which is super, super handy. Otherwise, you never know where it's going to drop. Okay, so this is starting to look a little nicer, but there's not a whole lot of depth. The background is still looking pretty sharp, so we want to kind of adjust that a little bit. So what we're going to do is blur it out. So I'm going to click on that background, and I'm going to head up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. So now that dialog box, you can play around with the settings and how blurry or sharp you want to make that. So I'm just going to play around with that here. So it's starting to look a lot better, but it's still bright and it competes a little bit too much with the Polaroid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over to make sure that that layer is still selected, head over to the effects button, and I'm going to click on color overlay. So in the layer styles dialog box that pops up, the color overlay is already selected. And it's got all the defaults, or at least the defaults for since I was last using Photoshop. And the default color is white, but what I actually want is black. I'm gonna click on that little color swatch and choose black. So then I'm going to change the opacity quite a bit so that it darkens up the photo a little bit while still keeping it visible. The other thing you can do is play around with the blend modes. One of my favorites is multiply, but when you're using 100% black, the blend modes have less of an effect on the image. So for now, we're just going to leave it at normal. Okay, it's looking better, but it's still kind of boring. The Polaroid is just kind of sitting there. It's not doing it for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this a little bit just to give it a little bit of a better feel. So like I did before on a couple of other steps, I'm going to hit Command-T on the keyboard, and that allows me to transform this. So if I hover around the edges, you can see that I get a curved double arrow cursor. And what that means is it lets me rotate it. So I don't want to rotate too much because it then becomes very amateurish. So I'm just going to rotate it about that much, and then I'm going to hit return on my keyboard to commit that change. Okay, so this looks pretty good in my opinion. The next step, how do we get this image onto our phone? First of all, we need to get it in the right format, and then we need to transfer it to our phone. So first thing, you need to save the document. Command S to save, and you need to give it a file name. Okay, back with the original Polaroid file, I'm going to close it, but I'm not going to save it because otherwise it's going to commit those changes that I did earlier. And since it's my original file, we want to leave that blank so we can use it again later on. Okay, so now we need to get it in the right format. So head on up to File, Export, Export As. You can leave most of the settings as they are, but up in the upper right hand corner you're going to want to make sure that it is a JPEG. If it's a PNG, it's not that big a deal, but a JPEG is going to be much better for your colors and your contrast. So then you can just hit export and it's going to ask you where to save it. Just save it on your desktop. That's probably easiest. Okay, now I can save the file and close out of Photoshop. Okay, so now it's time to get this JPEG onto our phone. Now, full disclosure here, I only use iPhones. I've never used an Android or a Windows phone or anything like that. So if that's what you use, unfortunately you're just going to have to figure out how to get your file onto your phone. If you use an iPhone, however, the easiest thing to use is AirDrop. So you need to make sure that you have AirDrop enabled both on your computer and your phone. Then from your computer, you're going to right click on the file, wherever that file may be sitting, and in that menu you're going to hit Share, AirDrop. So then a dialog box will pop up and your phone should show up. Once it does show up, you just click on it and it starts sending the file over. The actual file sending is really quick, especially for something like this because the file is pretty small. When the file finally hits your phone, it's actually going to save it directly to your camera roll, which is super cool because you can see it right away. So because it's on your camera roll now, you can just go ahead and upload it to Instagram or Facebook or whatever you want to do with it. So that's all there is to it. That's how you create a cool Polaroid image for your social media or whatever it is you need to use it for. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below. If you like this video, hit that like button. And hey, if you feel like it, how about hitting that subscribe button? See you on the next video.